It's a pleasure to be back giving another paper at the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. My first one was 5 years ago at the 24th annual meeting on iodine. This one at lunch will be on the controversial subject of saturated fats. And I've noticed that one of the themes of this meeting is the bad things that government do to our lives. And I will follow this theme in this talk with regard to nutrition. The medical establishment and government health authorities say the consumption of saturated fat is bad for us and causes heart disease. According to the lipid hypothesis, the label used for the diet cholesterol theory of heart disease, saturated fats raise serum cholesterol levels, and high blood cholesterol causes obstructive plaques to form in arteries. Called atherosclerosis, this pathologic process causes coronary heart disease and the need for coronary artery bypass surgery, which is what I do. Animals and tropical plants contain saturated fats, while plants outside the tropics are mostly unsaturated. Saturated animal fats are in milk, meat, eggs, butter, and cheese. And tropical coconut and palm oil contain a lot of saturated fat. The food industry makes trans fats. They do this by shooting hydrogen atoms into polyunsaturated vegetable oils. This straightens out the fatty acid molecules and packs them closer together, giving vegetable oil so treated a solid texture like lard. Trans fats are used to make margarine, with yellow bleach added so it looks like butter. They also are used to prolong the shelf life of bakery products, snacks, chips, imitation cheese, and other processed food. A saturated fat is a string of 3 to 22 carbon atoms that are fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. Unsaturated fat lacks a full complement of hydrogen atoms. Unsaturated alpha-linoleic acid, for example, has 3 carbon double bonds. Artificially created trans fats have hydrogen atoms that wind up being opposite sides of the carbon double bond, which straightens the molecule out and makes it mimic saturated fat. 100 years ago, less than 1 in 100 Americans were obese, and coronary heart disease was unknown. Pneumonia, diarrhea, and enteritis, and tuberculosis were the most common causes of death. Now, a century later, heart disease and cancer are the most common causes of death, which account for 75% of all deaths in this country. There were 500 cardiologists practicing in the U.S. in 1950. There are 30,000 of them now, a 60-fold increase in a population that has only doubled since 1950. In 1911, Procter & Gamble started marketing Crisco as a new kind of food. The name Crisco is derived from crystallized cottonseed oil. It was the first commercially marketed trans fat. Crisco was used to make candles and soap, but with electrification causing a decline in candle sales, Procter & Gamble decided to promote this new type of fat as an all-vegetable-derived shortening, which the company marketed as a healthier alternative to cooking with animal fats. At the time, Americans cooked and baked food with lard, pork fat, tallow, beef and lamb fat, and butter. Procter & Gamble published a free cookbook with 615 recipes from pound cake to lobster bisque, all of which required Crisco. The company succeeded in demonizing lard, and during the 20th century, Crisco and other trans fat vegetable oils gradually replaced saturated animal fats and tropical oils in the American diet. Then in 1913, a Russian physiologist fed high doses of cholesterol to rabbits and showed that cholesterol caused atherosclerotic changes in the rabbit's arterial intima, like that seen in human atherosclerosis. Over the ensuing decades, other investigators did atherosclerosis research on cholesterol-fed rabbits, which they cited in support of the diet cholesterol theory of heart disease. In 1948, government-funded investigators began following some 5,000 men and women in Framingham, Massachusetts, to see who developed coronary heart disease. They found that people with elevated cholesterol were more likely to be diagnosed with coronary disease and die from it. 6 years later, the American Heart Association began promoting what it called the prudent diet, where corn oil, margarine, chicken, and cold cereal replaced butter, lard, beef, and eggs. Ansel Keys, the father of K rations for the military, published a study in 1953 that correlated deaths from heart disease with the percentage of calories from fat in the diet. He found that fat consumption was associated with an increased rate of death from heart disease in the 6 countries that he studied. He followed this up with a more detailed 7-country study published in 1970, using 3 of the countries that were in the original 6-country study: Italy, Japan, and the US, and 4 other countries: Finland, Greece, the Netherlands, and Yugoslavia. This study further cemented the association of fat consumption and death from heart disease, which led to the McGovern Report. The U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, chaired by Senator George McGovern, released in 1977 its dietary goals for the United States, designed to reduce fat intake and avoid cholesterol-rich foods. These dietary goals became official government policy. Next, in 1984, the Center for Science in the Public Interest, a consumer advocacy group, joined the fray and started to coerce fast food restaurants and the food industry to stop baking and frying food with animal fats and tropical oils. McDonald's fried its French fries with beef fat and palm oil. That's why they tasted so good. But the Center for Science in the Public Interest, well-orchestrated saturated fat attack, coerced McDonald's and other fast food chains to switch to partially hydrogenated trans fat vegetable oil. Adhering to the now well-established low-fat dogma, the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1992 published its Food Guide Pyramid. The pyramid arranges food in sections that convey the message: fat is bad, carbohydrates are good. Carbohydrate-rich bread, cereal, rice, pasta fill the large bottom space and are to be consumed in abundant amounts, 6 to 11 servings a day. Further up, as the pyramid narrows, fruit, which is also high in carbohydrates, is accorded 2 to 4 servings, whereas the portion that includes meat, fish, dried beans, eggs, and nuts is allowed only 2 to 3 servings. Fats and oils are placed at the small top portion of the pyramid and labeled "use sparingly." Beginning in 1980, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Department of Health and Human Services has published every 5 years an updated dietary guidelines for Americans. The most recent one, published in December 2010, recommends reducing saturated fat to 7% of caloric intake, down from its previously recommended 10%. The USDA Dietary Guidelines and the American Heart Association group trans fats and saturated fats together and demonize them both as solid fats. The Heart Association's website has a Meet the Fats link, where bad fats are brothers sat and trans, saturated and trans fats. The better fats are sisters poly and mon, polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat. Indoctrinated in the low-fat dogma by health organizations, nutritional authorities, and government, I would instruct my heart surgery patients to eat a low-fat diet, telling them to cut all the fat off their meat and to not eat more than 1 egg a week. Following the USDA food pyramid, I did not express any concerns about how much carbohydrates they might consume from starch in bread, pasta, and potatoes, and sugar in fruit juices, pastry, and sodas. When I was director of the Heart Institute at the Swedish Medical Center in Seattle in the 1990s, I looked into establishing a Dean Ornish program for reversing heart disease. The Ornish program limits fat intake to less than 10% of calories in the diet, with, as one study shows, only 1% being saturated fat. I had a cardiologist at Swedish accompany me to New York to visit the leading Dean Ornish program there, and we came back and recommended that Swedish establish one in Seattle. I was wrong. Several years later, after leaving Swedish and rejoining the faculty of the University of Washington, I came upon an article by Dr. Mary Innig and Sally Fallon titled The Oiling of America that was published in the magazine Nexus in 1999. It stimulated me to look more carefully into this subject. Oscar Wilde said, "Life imitates art." He pointed out that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. In his film Sleeper, Woody Allen plays Miles Monroe, part owner of the Happy Carrot health food restaurant in Greenwich Village. He was cryogenically frozen in 1973 after a botched peptic ulcer operation done at the now closed St. Vincent Hospital. 200 years later, scientists wake him up and revive him. This shows Miles outside being taken out for a walk. The two scientists looking at him have this exchange.
Well, he's fully recovered, except for a few minor kinks.
Has he asked for anything special?
Yes, this morning for breakfast, he requested something called wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk.
Oh, yes, those are the charmed substances that some years ago were felt to contain life-preserving properties.
You mean there was no deep fat? No steak or cream pies or hot fudge?
Those were thought to be unhealthy. Precisely the opposite of what we now know to be true.
Incredible.
The tiger's milk is said to be America's original carbohydrate-rich, protein-rich nutrition bar. It was popular in the 1970s, and you can still get it now on Amazon.com. As this cinematic work of art predicts, in 2173, deep fat, steak, cream pies, and hot fudge will have replaced wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk as health foods. The title of this segment on YouTube is Woody Allen's 1973 film Sleeper may accurately portray healthy eating in the future. The plants do not contain any cholesterol, and animals are the only source of cholesterol, and herbivores do not eat animal products. Rabbits, being a herbivore, are not designed to digest animal fat and cholesterol. So when it is fed high doses of cholesterol, one should not be surprised if the cholesterol winds up getting stuck in any part of the poor rabbit, including his blood vessels. Feeding high doses of fat and cholesterol to omnivores, like rats and dogs, does not produce atherosclerotic lesions in them. Evidence against fat wilts upon close scrutiny. In his 6-country study, Ansel Keys ignored data available from 16 other countries that did not fall in line with his desired graph. If he had chosen these 6 other countries on the left side, and even more strikingly on the bottom right, he could have shown that increasing percent of calories from fat in the diet reduces the number of deaths from heart disease. If Keys had included all 22 countries in his study, the result would have been a clutter of dots like this. In fact, it turns out that people who have the highest percentage of saturated fat in their diets have the lowest risk of heart disease. The diet of the Maasai tribe in Kenya and northern Tanzania consists of meat, milk, and blood from cattle. It is 66% saturated fat. The Rendili, diet of the Inuit Eskimos, consisting largely of whale meat and blubber, is 75% saturated fat. The Rendili in the Kazut Desert in northeast Kenya eat camel milk and meat, and banjo, a mixture of camel milk and blood. Their diet is 63% saturated fat. And the Tokolo live well without cardiologists on 3 atoll islands that are now a territory of New Zealand. Their diet consists of fish and coconuts, which is 60% fat. Like these groups of people around the world, breastfed infants in developed first world countries also have a diet that is high in saturated fat. The fat in human mother's milk is 54% saturated. This study referenced here on this slide was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and is considered to be the most comprehensive analysis done on the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer diet. Anthropologists have assessed the diets in 229 hunter-gatherer populations that survived into the 20th century and can be viewed as surrogates for our Paleolithic Stone Age ancestors. When they can get it, these modern-day hunter-gatherers consume high amounts of animal food, which can make up to 85 to 100% of their calories, like the Maasai, Inuit, and Rendili peoples. They eat virtually all of the fat on the animal, including its organs, tongue, bone marrow, and brain. Other carnivores do the same thing. Lions, for example, will eat the organs and fat of their kill and leave the lean muscle meat for scavengers. Since hunter-gatherers do not engage in agriculture, they have no corn, rice, wheat to eat. They obtain only a low amount of carbohydrates from wild plants, gathering seeds, nuts, roots, tubers, bulbs, and fruits from them. The Paleolithic era, or Stone Age, lasted 2.5 million years, beginning with our human ancestor Homo habilis, and progressing through a succession of species to ours, Homo sapiens, which has existed for some 200,000 years. The age of agriculture began approximately 10,000 years ago, and during this time, through 500 generations, carbohydrate consumption gradually increased. Even so, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago, sugar consumption was 1/5 of what it is today. Now we are eating a greatly increased amount of carbs in cereal grains, dairy products, beverages, refined sugar, and candy, along with processed vegetable oils and dressings that did not exist in our diet for 99.9% of human history. During this time, the human genome became adapted to follow a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. Nevertheless, health authorities today say that we should do the opposite and follow a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. As calories, fat and carbs are interchangeable, protein less so. One can eat and digest only so much protein. When the protein content in the diet exceeds 35% of calories, nausea, diarrhea, and weakness occur. And these symptoms disappear when the protein is dropped back down to 20 to 25%. The new social media of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube is not only helping to overthrow dictators and autocratic regimes, but also wrong medical dogmas. This one, titled Big Fat Lies, exposes the chicanery that Ansel Keys practiced in his work.
If you could pack all of human history into 1 year, we've only been farming and eating grain since about yesterday, which is when we became shorter and fatter. We only started consuming processed vegetable oils about 10 minutes ago, which is when heart disease became our #1 killer. So after examining all this human history, the experts came to the obvious conclusion. We need to eat a lot more of these. And so they convinced us that human health depends on foods we didn't eat for more than 99% of our entire existence. How did this happen? In the 1950s, a biochemist named Ancel Keys published a study that compared heart disease and fat consumption in a half-dozen countries. The more fat, the more heart disease. The trend line was unmistakable. Just one little problem. Keys left out countries where people eat a lot of fat but have very little heart disease, like Holland and Norway. He also left out countries where people don't eat much fat but do have a lot of heart disease, like Chile. In fact, Keys had reliable data from 22 countries, and the results were all over the place. But you can't make a big splash in the scientific community with a trend line that looks like this. So Keys did what any dedicated researcher would do. He threw out the data that didn't fit and published his results. His punishment for this bit of scientific chicanery was to get his picture on the cover of Time magazine. Keys became known as the father of the lipid hypothesis, which says that eating saturated fat raises the cholesterol in your blood, and high cholesterol in your blood clogs your arteries and causes heart disease.
The hypothesis that when you eat high fat, that produces high cholesterol, and the cholesterol produces heart disease, is wrong in every one of those links.
This whole idea that dietary fat causes cholesterol problems is sort of a myth. The whole idea that cholesterol problems lead to heart disease is a myth.
The theory is completely and totally wrong. It was a theory that was made out of whole cloth and then pushed.
The term artery clogging saturated fat, it's as though it's all one word.
It's become part of the zeitgeist. Everybody knows saturated fat is bad for you, but when you get back and you start looking at the medical literature and you root back through to find out where this whole idea came from, it's bogus.
So in looking at the evidence that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease, we see that the Ancel Keys study that was so influential with medical organizations and the government is bogus. The rabbit studies with atherosclerosis from cholesterol is inappropriate because they're herbivores. But what about the Framingham study? Well, it turns out that 30 years later, this is what the leaders of the study reported. Two important findings. Over age 50, there is no increased overall mortality with either high or low serum cholesterol levels. And in people with a falling cholesterol level, over the first 14 years of the study, for each 1% milligram per deciliter drop in cholesterol, there was 11% increase in all-cause mortality over the next 18 years. And Dr. Castelli, the third director of the study, in 1992 in the Archives of Internal Medicine, wrote, and I'll just read it, in Framingham, Massachusetts, the more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the more calories one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol. We found that people who ate the most cholesterol, ate the most saturated fat, ate the most calories, weighed the least, and were the most physically active. Well, we have the McGovern report that put out this low-fat diet. What's the story on the McGovern report?
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day.
You know, there were eminent scientists of the time saying this is nonsense. There is no good scientific evidence that either fat or cholesterol, is at the root of heart disease.
I said to the professor that I was working with, this is not right. Animal fat's not causing this.
And now, this was Mary Innig again, and I just would like to note about her. She's the one who wrote the article that got me started on reevaluating all of this. She's a researcher at the University of Maryland, and in 1978, she was the lone whistleblower warning people about the dangers of trans fats. The medical establishment, government, and the food and drug industry belittled her findings and ignored them, that trans fats interfere with critical enzyme systems in the body, and suppressed her findings for 25 years. As evidence of their danger continued to grow, the FDA finally in 2003 announced that beginning in 2006, the food industry must display how much trans fat the product contains on its nutritional facts label. Having ignored the subject since its inception in 1980, the government's 2005 Dietary Guidelines for Americans at last warned them to restrict their consumption of trans fats. In 2006, New York became the first city in the nation to ban trans fats from restaurant food.
I said to the professor that I was working with, this is not right. Animal fat's not causing this, and this is not what the data says.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
The McGovern Committee's report was written by a young staff member who happened to be a vegetarian and had no background in medicine or health research. The committee recommended a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet for everyone and offered some ideas that could only spring from the mind of a politician.
But Senator Schweiker of Pennsylvania suggested that instead of discrediting the committee's report, the eggmen should be out developing hens that would lay low-cholesterol eggs.
Soon after the McGovern report was issued, the USDA got into the act. Carol Tucker Foreman, the assistant secretary at the time, believed in the low-fat diet theory and wanted to issue official government guidelines to tell everybody how to eat. To make sure she was on solid scientific ground, she consulted with Philip Handler, the head of the National Academy of Sciences. Just one little problem. Handler told her the McGovern Committee's report was nonsense. So she did what any dedicated government official would do. She ignored him, shopped around for a scientist who agreed with her, then issued the guidelines. Thanks to a handful of politicians with no background in science, the heart-healthy benefits of a low-fat diet became official government policy. And real scientists got the message loud and clear. Tell us what we already believe, or you can say goodbye to your lucrative government funding.
Couldn't be better said. Evidence that the McGovern Committee did not have in the 1970s is this 2005 report of European cardiovascular disease statistics. They show an inverse correlation with fat consumption and the rate of heart disease. Countries with the lowest consumption of saturated fat have the highest rates of heart disease. Georgia, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Croatia, Macedonia, Ukraine all have saturated fat consumption that is less than 7.5% of calories, which is what the USDA and the American Heart Association recommend. But their death rate from heart disease is quite high. Austria, Finland, Belgium, Iceland, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and France have high levels of saturated fat in the diet and low rates of heart disease. France, with the highest fat consumption, has the lowest rate of deaths from heart disease among these 14 European countries. The biologic importance of saturated fat. There's good reason why 54% of the fat in mother's milk is saturated fat. Cell membranes need saturated fatty acids to function properly and be waterproof. The heart prefers long-chain 16-carbon palmitic and 18C stearic acid over carbohydrates for energy. Bones need them to assimilate calcium effectively. They protect the liver from adverse effects of alcohol and medications like Tylenol. Lung surfactant is composed entirely of 16C palmitic acid. When present in sufficient amounts, it prevents asthma and other breathing disorders. Saturated fats function as signaling messengers for hormone production. They play an important role in the immune system. priming white blood cells to destroy invading bacteria, viruses, and fungi, and to fight tumors. And medium chain 12C lauric and 14C myristic acid in butter kill bacteria and Candida fungus. Saturated fat signals satiety. You stop eating because you feel full, lose fat, and maintain a normal weight. And importantly, saturated fats reduces consumption of health-damaging carbohydrates and vegetable oils. Like what Tom DeWeese yesterday said is starting to happen with citizen-led attacks on sustainable development. The American Journal of Nutrition, one of the leading establishment medical journals that defends the hypothesis, is now backing down and reporting cracks in the wall of the diet cholesterol heart orthodoxy. A meta-analysis of the prospective cohort studies evaluating the association of saturated fat with cardiovascular disease does not support the notion that saturated fats increase the risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or peripheral vascular disease. And this journal recently published a prospective cohort study of 53,000 women and men comparing their intake of carbohydrates and saturated fats, and found that replacement of saturated fats with high glycemic index carbohydrates significantly increases the risk of heart attacks. I particularly like this study. This trial, published in the journal Lipids, enrolled 40 women with a waist circumference greater than 35 inches. 20 were randomized to take 30 milliliters, 2 tablespoons of coconut oil a day, at Group C, and the other 20 took 30 milliliters of soybean oil a day for 12 weeks. The Group C women taking the coconut oil exhibited a significant reduction in waist circumference. For the statisticians among us, a p-value of 0.005. And there was no change in the soybean group. And the only thing that the saturated fat-laden coconut oil did to cholesterol levels was to raise HDL cholesterol, the one that advocates of the lipid hypothesis call the good cholesterol. Dr. Mary Inning and Sally Fallon, who is the president of the Weston Price Foundation, have written a book titled Eat Fat, Lose Weight, and Feel Great with 3 delicious science-based coconut diets. I highly recommend it. The fat content of coconut oil is 92% saturated, the highest saturated fat content of any food. I now start each day with 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. Well, what about cholesterol? As with saturated fat, it is not a villain. On the contrary, cholesterol is critical for good health. It is an essential component of every cell in the body. And although few doctors know this, more than 20 studies have shown that elderly people with a high cholesterol level in their blood live longer than those who have a low cholesterol. Cholesterol is the mother of all hormones. It is converted into stress and sex hormones like cortisol, testosterone, and estradiol in the adrenal cortex. The liver turns cholesterol into bile salts needed for intestinal absorption of fats and the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. And when exposed to UVB rays in sunlight or a tanning salon, the skin turns cholesterol into vitamin D. Cholesterol is also the body's fire brigade. It repairs damage to the body's tissues, particularly the damage in arteries inflammation does to cause atherosclerosis. Blaming cholesterol for atherosclerosis is like blaming firemen for the fire they have come to put out. Along with saturated fats, cholesterol is an integral component of cell membranes. Brain and nerve tissue have the highest concentration of cholesterol in the body. It is a key component in forming synapses, cell connections, needed for good mental functioning, learning, and memory. So if not cholesterol, what causes heart disease? Well, atherosclerosis is basically an inflammatory process and brought on by eating too many carbohydrates and omega-6 vegetable oils. Stress also plays a role, and possibly also bacterial infection. A deficiency of various vitamins, shown here, and may also play a role in causing atherosclerotic heart disease, as may an excess or deficiency of various minerals. Over the past century, butter consumption has plummeted from 18 grams per person a day to 5 grams. Consumption of lard has dropped substantially, while the use of shortening has almost tripled. In 1909, shortening was a natural product made with coconut oil and lard. Shortening used today is made out of partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. Consumption of margarine made with trans fats has gone up 5-fold, and vegetable oils more than 15-fold. By 1950, nearly 10% of Americans were obese. 30 years later, in 1980, it had risen to 15%. Then, following publication of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines and its every 5-year updates, obesity in Americans has steadily risen. Now, 2/3 of the American public is overweight, with more than 1/3 obese. The average American now weighs 191 pounds, the American men, and American women 167 pounds, and that's 30 pounds more than he or she weighed 100 years ago. The rise in obesity parallels closely the rise in carbohydrate intake. And as Gary Taub shows in his book, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, carbohydrates, not overeating or a sedentary life, are what make you fat. Eating fat and protein doesn't make us fat. Only carbohydrates do. This graph in Mark Sisson's book, The Primal Blueprint, compares carbohydrate intake with weight. Consuming less than 150 grams of carbs a day enables one to maintain a stable weight. More than that, and you gain weight. One burns more fat and will lose weight when the carbohydrate intake is less than 100 grams. Unfortunately, Americans today consume between 300 and 500 grams of carbs a day. In over a 30-year period, from 1980 to 2008, the prevalence of diabetes has tripled. Now, in 2011, according to the National Diabetes Fact Sheet, 25.8 million children and adults in the U.S., 8.3% of the population, have diabetes. And 79 million people, based on their fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C levels, are pre-diabetic. In fact, diabetes and obesity go together, so much so that these disorders are now being called diabesity. Body mass index is a commonly used measure for obesity, calculated by dividing one's weight in kilograms by one's height in meters squared. One is considered obese if the BMI is greater than 30, and morbidly obese if it's greater than 35. The lifetime risk for diabetes is around 30% for people who are overweight with a BMI of 25 to 30, 50% for obese people, and 70% for people that are morbidly obese. Consumption of butter has dropped precipitously, while cancer and heart disease has soared. The rise in cancer and heart disease cannot be blamed on a high saturated fat diet. These books prove beyond a reasonable doubt that today's chronic diseases, such as diabetes, heart disease, obesity, stroke, cancer, are nutritional diseases, a resulting of eating a low-fat, mainly polyunsaturated vegetable oil, high-carbohydrate diet. Alice and Fred Ottoboni wrote Modern Nutritional Diseases: Heart Disease, Stroke, Type 2 Diabetes, Obesity, Cancer, and How to Prevent Them. Barry Groves, Trick or Treat: How Healthy Eating is Making Us Ill. And Zoe Harcombe, The Obesity Epidemic: What Caused It? How Can We Stop It? Barry Groves, in particular, citing more than 1,000 references, documents how so-called healthy eating is making us ill. A 12-ounce can of Coke has 10 teaspoons of sugar, which contain 42 grams of sugar, supplying 167 calories. A 20-ounce bottle has 17, a 30-ounce bottle, 27 teaspoons of sugar. The average American drinks 600 cans, 56 gallons of soft drinks a year, up from 216 in 1971. The average American teenager drinks between 3 and 6 cans a day. 1/3 of our dietary sugar comes from sodas and have become America's #1 source of calories. Disasters that may confront us can be divided into ones that are natural and those that are human-made. Natural ones range from earthquakes to an impact event, like the one 65 million years ago when an asteroid 6 miles in diameter collided with the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs and all life forms larger than the size of a small chicken. Human-made disasters include political, economic, and martial types, a number of which DDP has addressed. To this list must be added the nutritional disaster of a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. These trucks laden with soda pop serve as its weapons of mass destruction. In addition to Eat Fat, Lose Fat, I recommend 2 more books that can help us reduce our carbohydrate intake. And these are listed in the handout that you've received. One is Life Without Bread, How a Low Carbohydrate Diet Can Save Your Life. It describes diets that limit carbohydrate intake to 72 grams a day, which is the equivalent of 6 slices of bread. The other one is Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It by Gary Taubes. Noting that meat, fish, and eggs contain no carbohydrates, he suggests that you eat as much of them as you like, along with leafy green vegetables. Try chicken salad wrapped in lettuce for a lunch sandwich. The ideal caloric ratio between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins is carbohydrates 10 to 15%, protein 15 to 25%, and fats 60 to 70%, with saturated fats composing the majority of the fats. Among the different kinds of fats, saturated fats and monounsaturated fats are good. And except for omega-3 and small amounts of omega-6 essential fatty acids, polyunsaturated fats are bad. And in the particularly in the high quantities that we have them in a Western diet. Saturated animal fat is best obtained from grass-fed beef and pastured chickens, along with nitrate-free and additive-free bacon and sausage, and seafood from wild, not farm-raised fish. Healthy milk and meat comes from contented cows on pasture, eating grass food that they are designed to eat. Confinement operations like these produce meat that is too high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fat and too low in vitamins. It being certified organic is not sufficient. The turkeys in the photo in the lower left can be sold as organic because they're cage-free. The best meat to eat is that which is certified humanely treated or 100% grass-fed finished. Pastured poultry produces eggs much richer in nutrients such as vitamin D and A and omega-3 fatty acids. Like with the turkeys so confined, organic eggs are produced mainly in barns. One wants to eat pastured eggs like those sold at a farmer's market. The color of the yolk is an indication of the presence of nutrients. The pastured egg, with its dark orange color, is full of nutrients. The organic store egg, less so. The supermarket egg pale as it is, could be even whiter if the chickens weren't fed orange foods and dyes. The butter on the right was made from cream from cows on green pasture. The deep yellow color is indicative of high levels of omega-3 fats and fat-soluble vitamins. The butter on the left was made with cream from confined cows. Commercial butter like this has artificial color added to it, so the consumer will not know that it is actually colorless. Two articles that I recommend that you can get online on this subject is The Oiling of America and an article I wrote published last year on the health benefits of a low-carbohydrate, high-saturated fat diet. I did a podcast on the health benefits of a low-carbohydrate, high-saturated fat diet on the Livin' La Vida low-carb show. The show's host, Jimmy Moore, has titled it, Cardiac Surgeon Dr. Donald Miller Tells Dr. Dean Ornish to Take a Hike. And for those of you who would like to delve further into this subject, I highly recommend these two books, written by a cardiologist, Dr. Ravenscoff. These books are a must-read for anyone taking statins to lower their cholesterol. Supporters of the orthodox view that saturated in cholesterol cause heart disease, who dismiss these books unread, bring to mind George Orwell's definition of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. And Frank Zappa put it well when he said, "The mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open." One needs to approach this subject with an open mind. The last word on this subject, of course, should go to Julia Child.
I like McDonald's. I think they're very careful, and I think if they have you buy a franchise, I think you only have a certain amount so that you're in charge and they have their standards and so forth. And I thought when they first started out, the French fries were very good. And then the nutritionists got at them that it turned out to be erroneous that beef tallow fat was bad and that lard was bad and so forth. And so they changed it to some kind of a nutritionist oil, and they've been kind of limp ever since. I never really eat them, which is too bad. And I always am very strong about criticizing it, hoping maybe they'll change.
So enjoy eating saturated fats. They're good for you.
I agree heartily with your basic thesis that it's ridiculous for a government to attempt to impose an average on the populace, especially with what has been happening. However, having subspecialized in preventive cardiology for over 50 years, you're omitting what we just learned this morning about the dose in radiation, the dose. And you can easily, as you correlate waistlines with mortality, see the first step. Secondly, the beta blockers, where the Korean soldiers were found to have coronary artery disease with the fear and anger. And then the beta blocker studies. And I have a study here that I pass out to my patients that show that indeed the Cleveland Clinic has found that by giving beta blockers, they reduce the plaque in the coronary arteries. So I agree heartily with your basic thesis, only it's too narrow. You know, also on dose, exercise, and adrenaline.
I promise him the next one, then you, okay? Go to you next.
I noticed two items in this talk here. You did not make a distinction between, or at least I didn't pick it up, refined carbos and highly complex. Highly complex being such things as whole, 100% whole wheat, and most raw vegetables. And then also, if you delete a lot of these carbos, where are you going to get your fiber, which I believe is also rather necessary for good, we'll call it digestive health.
The refined carbohydrates get absorbed and raise the blood glucose level faster than will starch. But the starch our carbohydrates are change the glucose molecules, and they do eventually get released and put stress on insulin needs, and so it's pretty much all together. I don't know what to say about fiber, but if you eat a lot of meat, you get fiber.
The Environmental Protection Agency, its effort to decarbonize the United States, is saying the incidence of asthma is due to burning fossil fuels, and they want to cut back on that. Okay, I can remember the 1940s. Pollution was 1,000 times worse than what we have today, and I heard the word asthma, and I never, ever heard of anybody having it. And now you've hit upon this thing on diet, increased asthma. Could this be the solution?
Yes, the lung surfactant, which prevents asthma, is made solely of 16C palmitic acid, a saturated fat. So if you're cutting back on your saturated fats, you're not making enough lung surfactant, and you get more prone to asthma.
Yes, I strongly agree with your talk. I know you're a cardiologist, and I would also like to hear at some point from
Please correct that. I'm not a cardiologist. I'm a cardiac surgeon. Yeah.
Okay. I think there's also a neurologic part of this, which is whether these diets affect our behavior. And I go no further than the fact that in the past, with infants that had seizures, they would use ketogenic diets, and that would stop the seizures. And I think there's a strong neurologic issue with diet as well.
I agree.
Great lecture. I do have a question, however, about artificial sweeteners, in particular aspartame. Do you have any comments on that? I've heard that it is linked to obesity.
They do.
Any comments?
Yeah. The artificial sweeteners are neurotoxic, and they lead to obesity because the body's not satisfied that it didn't get the real thing, and so you eat more.
Are there any studies being done right now looking at lack of ingestion of fats with Alzheimer's?
Could you repeat the question?
Just a correlation between a deficiency in saturated fats and either onset or incidence of Alzheimer's disease.
Well, I'm not aware of any, but there is a body of literature that would indicate that low saturated fat is associated with neurodegenerative diseases, which would include Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism and others.
Just one at the bottom line. Can I tell my wife that I can now eat higher fat ice cream and full milk? Is that all right?
Yes.
I can quote you on that? All right, thank you.